Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to another Slow Factory Open Education course. Today, we will be talking about the historical and current impacts of the fashion industry on labor and the environment. We're going to go through some slides. We'll have some time for questions, and we'll take it from there. Thank you all for joining us. So today's course, we'll first learn about the impact of cotton cultivation on the environment and Black people during slavery, after which we'll discuss a few current examples of fashion's impact on the environment and people outside of the US. This course will help participants to understand the intersectional negative impacts that mainstream fashion has on women, people of color, and the earth. Just a disclaimer, the topics discussed in this course are by no means comprehensive or exhaustive descriptions of histories. Rather, history is used to explain the moments that were part of shaping our contemporary fashion industry. So I'm not a historian, I am a writer and a geographer, and I use history as a way to connect the dots between what happened in the past and the legacies that still exist today. So although I'll be talking about historical moments, this is not a history course. So first, we're going to start by defining some terms and some context around the topics that we'll be discussing today. So the fashion industry, I'm defining the fashion industry of consisting of 4 levels: the production of raw materials, principally fibers and textiles, the production of goods that are a form of aesthetic expression by designers, manufacturers, contractors, and others, retail sales, and consumer markets, and various forms of advertising and promotion. And I'm defining the environment as the surroundings and conditions that we, along with other living things and non-living things, inhabit and operate in. This includes the natural world, human-built environments, and geographical areas that have been impacted in any way by humans. So this is the way I'm determining and defining the fashion industry and the environment in our course today. So my focus in this course is on how the first 2 levels of the fashion industry affect our environment. So how the production of raw materials, principally fibers and textiles, and the production of goods by designers, manufacturers, contractors, and others affects the surroundings and conditions that we, along with other living and non-living things, inhabit and operate in. So that's the basis from which we're starting our discussion today. I want to give a little context about cotton cultivation and the importance of cotton as a fiber and as really a foundational aspect of the US economy. So cotton is one of the earliest domesticated non-food crops, along with hemp, and was independently domesticated at least 4 different times in 4 different parts of the world more than 6,000 years ago. So it's an incredibly old domesticated cultivated crop for human civilizations more broadly. Old world cotton centers were the Indus Valley, which is now what is India and Pakistan, and tropical West Africa, both having advanced cotton cultivation practices and textile culture earlier than 900 AD. So in parts of South Asia and parts of Western and Central Africa, cotton cultivation and textile culture was developed in early civilizations before any colonial contact. There were trade systems with cotton and other fibers. There was textile culture, there was textile design, there was textile art, there was weaving, knitting, all kinds of fiber and textile practices in ancient civilizations in Western Africa and in South Asia. So New World cotton was cultivated by indigenous peoples across the Americas about 5,000 years ago, including in what is now considered the United States. So although Old World cotton isn't much older than New World cotton, the distinction, which you'll see in a second, is about cotton produced in the Americas, which makes it New World, which is a colonial identifier, versus cotton produced in ancient India and Africa, which is considered Old World cotton. So New World cotton was also kind of simultaneously cultivated throughout the Americas about 5,000 years ago. And so when tobacco farming proved to be too hard on the soil and less profitable, European settlers in the US decided to mass cultivate New World cotton so they could create and dominate a global market outside of tropical Africa and India. This was made possible by slavery. So New World cotton was coined that by European settlers who came to the Americas and discovered that there was also a cotton seed that had been cultivated and domesticated, so they didn't actually have to participate in the cotton fiber trade that had already existed for centuries in the Indus Valley and in tropical West Africa. So what they intended to do was to create a new market for cotton that they can control, and this was made possible by plantation slavery. So the cotton cultivation knowledge of Black Africans made them invaluable to developing a cotton industry in North America. So as Africans were forcibly brought over to the US to work on plantations, their knowledge of agriculture and specifically their long history of cotton cultivation made them very valuable to European settlers who were trying to create a cotton industry in the New World. So by mass cultivating cotton with free slave labor, European settlers could drive the price down of cotton, making it harder for other global fiber markets to compete. So by using free labor, cutting the costs of cultivating cotton, European settlers and the UK, because it was the British colony at the moment, were able to completely drive down the price of cotton and thus fiber cultivation. Additionally, through European colonial rule on the continent of Africa, colonial powers forced farmers to grow New World cotton. This further centralized and controlled cotton seeds and the entire fiber market cycle. So rather than allowing farmers in colonial Africa to continue cultivating the indigenous cotton seed, the Old World cotton seed, what European colonialism forced on many farmers is for them to grow New World cotton from their seeds, which they controlled. So that continued to control not only the production of cotton, but this whole market cycle of fiber and textiles that were developing from the cotton industry that was growing in the Americas. It's not an accident that the fibers we have most access to are cotton and synthetic fibers. This is by design so that the Western world can control the textile industry, even when clothing is being made thousands of miles away, right? So the control of the cotton seed, of the fiber cycle, of the fiber market is by design so that colonial powers, the US, the UK, the Western world can continue to control the supply chain, even though clothing is no longer made in the US or the UK. So I want to give some context about cotton in the fashion industry, specifically in the US, to just set the foundation for what we're talking about. So Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin in 1793 in the US. The gin made cotton cultivation into a more profitable crop by reducing its production time and making large-scale processing possible. The modern US fashion industry began in the early 19th century due to a century of slave-driven mass cotton cultivation and the onset of industrialization. So as a result of industrialization and being able to process cotton more quickly, they were able to grow this cotton industry, which started out a little bit small. And so actually, as a result of the creation of the cotton gin, there was a second wave of enslaved Africans taken from Africa to the New World to participate in this growing, booming cotton industry that was made even larger by the industrialization processes that were happening at the time. And so the fashion industry was able to develop as a result of not only cotton cultivated by enslaved Africans, but also as a result of the industrial tools that were being developed during this time. So now we're just going to talk a little bit more deeply about the history of cotton cultivation in the US and its impact on the nascent fashion industry at the time. So mass cultivation of cotton in the US required clearing the land and excessive deforestation. There was trees that were needed for wood to build plantation houses and fences. And in the process of clearing the land and cutting down trees, there was less natural cover to protect against natural disasters and climate stabilization. So you hear about colonial settlers, you hear about European explorers going to the New World and talking about how this loss of habitat has changed the climate because of so much deforestation. So when we first hear about climate change, it's actually in the context of plantation slavery and the deforestation that was necessary to create these large-scale plantations that were using monoculture. So monoculture is when you are cultivating one type of crop in mass. And so what is necessary for monoculture is eliminating insects and animals that want your crop because their habitat has been displaced due to deforestation. And when you're when you're cultivating one crop, insects are more drawn to it because there's not a diversity of plant life that they can eat on and work with. And so what this meant is that settlers not only had to get rid of the insects and animals, but essentially they had to get rid of the biodiversity, which includes plants that sequester carbon. So they got rid of some of the necessary natural tools that help carbon be sequestered from the atmosphere in the process of creating these plantations for mass monocultural production of cotton. So in the process of creating this cotton textile industry, there's huge amounts of impact on the environment that not only change the landscape of the US South, but also make the US South more susceptible to the natural disasters, and in turn start to change the climate because there's less cover from forests, there's less biodiversity that helps our ecosystem function healthily. What cotton cultivation also did to the environment was it necessitated excessive tillage and soil turnover, which resulted in soil erosion. So because there was not enough time between harvests for soil aggregates to regenerate, the soil started to erode. Because they were cultivating cotton on a mass level, rather than waiting for natural harvest cycles, waiting for time for the earth to regenerate, which is what indigenous communities did, they planted as much as possible, as often as possible, which created soil erosion. The other thing that happened during this mass cultivation of cotton was that they bred white cotton to allow for mass production and consistency of product. So cotton comes in many shades from brown to white, but mass producing it for profit requires uniformity, and it goes hand in hand with this ideology that white things are superior. So over the history of this country, a lot of bleach has been used in natural things like milk and cotton and other fibers to make it more white as opposed to brown. And so this is aligned with this ideology about white superiority. So even in the breeding of cotton, there's this ideology, racial ideology embedded into this process. And the breeding of white cotton in mass is also bad for the environment because it doesn't allow for a diversity of breeds. And also, this is the beginning of this relationship to mass production and uniformity, rather than things having their own variation based on being handmade or made in small batches. There's this idea that when you mass produce something, it has to look the same. And so we know that this same ideology exists in fashion, that a whole bunch of shirts or pants should all look the exact same. People don't always want those variations. So this started really with the ideologies and agricultural practices developed during the mass cultivation of cotton in the US during the enslavement of African people. So I just want to give an example of how this type of agricultural practices, these colonial agricultural practices, affect and impact the environment. So by time Haiti won independence from France in 1804, most of their land was no longer arable due to the monocultural practices of cultivating cotton, sugarcane, and coffee under French colonization and enslavement. So although Haiti was not in the US, there was cotton cultivation across the Americas, and this specific type of monocultural mass cultivation had negative impacts on the environment for years to come and still does today. And so Haiti was an example of how this intensive cultivation of monocultural products and this intensive colonization and enslavement completely eradicated the land. And there's less than 20% of arable land in Haiti today. And Haiti suffers as a result of not only this colonization, but also becoming independent in a world that still had slavery happening. So Haiti abolished slavery upon becoming independent, and as a result was completely cut out from the trade industry in the Americas. So by 1860, more than 70% of enslaved Blacks in the US South were picking cotton. So this is a massive industry. Most of the enslaved people in the 19th century in the US were picking cotton because of how gigantic this industry had become over the last decades that they had been cultivating it. And enslaved Blacks in this context were expected to work 10 acres of land and pick 200 pounds of cotton per day. So each individual enslaved person's yield was measured daily, and there were consequences for those who didn't meet their daily yield. So whether you were a pregnant woman or a child or a grown man, you had to pick about 200 pounds of cotton a day, carry it and weigh it. And if you didn't meet those measures, you were whipped or punished in other ways. It was nearly impossible to buy yourself out of slavery, no matter how much cotton you picked. And upon birth, your children were automatically slaves. And so this is why in some cases, women would kill their babies after they were born or force themselves to have abortions because they didn't want their children to be born into a system that not only degraded Black people, but also degraded the earth and was about backbreaking work. And so they worked slaves until death. And when new Black people were born, they were born into slavery. So this is unlike any other system of slavery that existed in the world before. In systems of slavery that existed in the world before, you could buy yourself out of slavery, and your children were not necessarily born into slavery. So this is a completely different system of slavery based on racial ideology, based on degrading the environment, based on Black death, and based on non-regenerative agricultural practices. So this is a whole system of violence, violent to the earth and violent to people. And this is providing the industry and the economy for the US. So if you're interested in learning more about the cotton economy during the enslavement of Africans in the US, Empire of Cotton is a really comprehensive book. And so in the 19th century, all US banks were invested in slavery and cotton since it was the first US luxury commodity. So now we think of jewelry, gold as luxury commodities, but actually cotton was the first luxury commodity in the US. And so all of the banks were giving loans to plantations, banks were giving loans to slave masters to buy enslaved people from Africa. They were giving loans to build ships that were bringing more people over from Africa. So all of the banks in the US that were in the US in the 19th century were connected to cotton because it was such a lucrative industry. The UK was able to take over the global textile industry, finally surpassing India because of slave-driven cotton cultivation in North America and in the Caribbean. So previously, to this mass cultivation of cotton in the New World, India having been the center of Old World cotton, having a huge textile culture and industry, was the global driver of textiles. But because of plantation slavery in the Americas and because the United States at that moment was a British colony, the UK was able to take over this global textile industry. In addition to them being one of the drivers of the Industrial Revolution, they were able to get cotton in mass for a cheaper price and develop it, process it in their factories. Many of these factories were worked by Caribbean people who were brought over in the 19th and 20th centuries to work in these factories. So it's really a system of Black labor, environmental degradation, building the economy of white European settlers and white British Europeans. The accessibility of cotton and industrialized processes made it so that the fashion industry had a steady supply of fiber in mass for the apparel it was producing. So what the cotton economy enabled fashion houses to do was to produce their garments in mass, to make more of them more quickly using this fiber that had been processed quickly, that was being produced in mass for very cheap. So this really set the foundation for the mainstream US fashion industry, this cotton economy. So Phil Thompson says, slaves hadn't gotten a paycheck in 300 years, so they knew it was a labor problem. You just didn't know. Harriet Tubman is not just my hero, she's your hero, a labor hero. Identity is about power, and we need to build power together. So what Phil Thompson is bringing to the forefront is that enslaved Black people recognized that being enslaved and creating this economy was an issue of labor and the environment. So Harriet Tubman was not just freeing slaves because she believed they didn't need to be enslaved. She was freeing slaves because she understood that the work that they were doing was actual labor that needed to be paid for. And also the way they were being forced into this labor was not at all dignified. It was not based in any rational thought. It was based in a racial ideology that justified this enslavement because of this ideology. And so this idea about identity, Black identity, was about power and building that power and recognizing that in building the US economy, there was an attempt to suppress the power of Black people so that they couldn't get out of slavery, so that the US can continue to develop and cut costs in the process. So once slavery was abolished, many Blacks stayed picking cotton as sharecroppers. However, labor conditions were not much better, and many sharecroppers were still not getting paid. Regardless, the agricultural labor cost costs increased a bit. So because they were no longer technically working for free, although in some cases they were, agricultural costs increased a bit. Due to structural environmental racism, Blacks were excluded from land ownership. They lacked government resources for their farms. They were pushed off the land by the KKK and other white people. Along with the automation of cotton farming, Black people could not stay in the cotton cultivation industry as it developed into the mid-20th century and beyond. So as the fiber and textile industry is developing in the US, slavery is abolished. Because of these structural racism and because of this environmental racism, Blacks were not able to participate in this industry as it grew. Black people have never recuperated the value of centuries of free labor picking cotton, which created the foundation for the US economy and the mainstream textile industry. So I want to stop there for a second to just answer a few questions, because I know that was a lot of history and a sort of really quick overview of the history of cotton cultivation and its relationship to the textile industry. So are there some questions that I could answer in the next few minutes? Did they ever get to use the Old World cotton? Did they ever try to? So yes, several indigenous African nations, the Ewe people, the Edo people, tried to maintain their indigenous cotton cultivation practices and their indigenous weaving and spinning cotton practices. But what it made difficult was it was hard to compete. Because the colonial powers had centralized cotton cultivation and manufacturing, made it cheaper, made it faster, people didn't want to rely on these indigenous ways of spinning cotton, weaving cotton, and growing cotton that were a little bit slower. So there are still these traditions in indigenous African cultures. They weren't completely eradicated by colonialism, but they were definitely decreased. Can you clarify why Old World cotton stopped being cultivated? So it was still being cultivated a little bit, but in colonial parts of Africa, the colonial powers, whether it was the British or the French, imposed New World cotton seeds on the farmers. So they told them they could no longer cultivate or grow Old World cotton seeds, that they had to get their seeds from the colonial powers and grow those cotton seeds instead. So it was because of colonialism that most indigenous communities in Western and Central Africa were no longer able to cultivate Old World cotton. Were Old World and New World indigenous textile methods devalued through advertisements and propaganda? At the moment that they were being devalued, there wasn't a lot of advertisements, but there was this idea that whatever the colonial powers are wanting you to do is better. And so, although many indigenous communities did not believe this, because that idea was forced on them over decades, they started to adopt this idea that what was being produced or suggested by colonial powers was better than the indigenous ways. And so even today in certain West African countries, there is this sort of contempt for indigenous practices as being less civilized or being less efficient, when in fact, that's a colonial ideology that has been developed and indoctrinated through education. How can we support Old World cotton production techniques now? There are some organizations, some people who are trying to help support indigenous African seed cultivation. And so one of the companies is called Seed to Shirt. They are an apparel company based in the US, but they work with farmers in Western Africa who are using non-GMO endemic cotton seeds. So they're helping those farmers to learn how to cultivate the indigenous cotton seeds, not have to buy GMO seeds from Monsanto, and bring back some of the indigenous cottonseed practices. So Seed to Shirt is an example of a company that is helping to support endemic seed production on the continent of Africa. Was Indian cotton introduced to Europe via the spice trade? I don't think specifically that Indian cotton was introduced to Europe via the spice trade, because cotton had been cultivated for years and years and years, but through contact with India, through colonial contact with India, the UK started to be aware of how much cotton was naturally cultivated there and how big of a textile industry they had. And so they realized that rather than trying to participate in this already existing industry, similar to the spice trade, that they should just create a whole new market for it. And so one of the issues with the spice trade and with cotton trade throughout sort of the old world, Africa, Asia, was that there were tariffs and higher prices for Europe to participate. So part of the impetus for colonization was to get rid of those tariffs, get rid of those barriers of participation, and lower the prices. And they did that mainly through violent colonization and through cultivating New World cotton in the US. Oh, I'm going to answer one more question. And the question is, how were the Old World and New World cotton seeds different? Were they different seeds completely? So yes, there were different seeds completely. There's several strains of cotton seeds. I don't know all the strains. I'm not a geologist or archaeologist, but the main difference is that there was a certain strain of cotton cultivated in the Americas, primarily Latin America, South America, North America, and then there was another two strains of cotton seeds that were cultivated in the Indus Valley, what is now India and Pakistan, and in tropical Africa, mainly the coast and Central Africa. So these were different strains of cotton and different seeds, but they were all domesticated by humans, and they were all cultivated by humans for at least, several thousands of years. So now we're going to fast forward a whole bunch and talk a little bit about the neoliberal policies and the mainstream fashion industry and how some of these environmental practices and labor practices have continued on this legacy of being bad to the earth and bad to people. So in the modern era, as the fashion industry grew into the 20th century, there was a desire to continually increase profits. This meant cutting costs at the first two levels of production of raw materials, and the production of goods. So the fashion industry is taking off. We're starting to see advertisements, trends, more people having more access to apparel and style and clothing as the US is developing. And so this profit imperative required trying to keep prices for raw materials down, as well as the labor that made these raw materials into apparel. This also meant creating synthetic petroleum-based fibers that were much less expensive to make and required less skills to produce than natural fibers. So in this process of the fashion industry growing, in this process of the US growing, there's this impetus towards profit to keep prices down and to keep prices down at the root, at raw materials, and at turning those raw materials into the apparel that we buy. And so what happened in the 70s is the bolstering of global capitalism by neoliberal policies. So in the 70s, politicians like Nixon, then later in the 80s, Thatcher and Reagan pushed neoliberal policies that allowed global capitalism to thrive. So I'm going to talk about some examples of what these neoliberal policies are and how they had an effect on the booming fashion industry. So unions and regulations were minimalized. That was one of the first things that was taking place during the 70s and 80s. And so this made way for wage suppression, labor exploitation, and environmental pollution. So when unions were not allowed to bargain, to increase wages, or to determine the conditions in which they worked, and to determine the different pollution that they saw happening, it made it more possible to completely suppress how much you have to pay people for work, to exploit their labor, and to continue polluting the environment. Public services were privatized along with tax cuts for the rich. So this made way for privatized healthcare and education and made it so that there was no mandate for wealth redistribution. So these are some of the ways that we see neoliberal policies coming up in the 70s and 80s and sort of eradicating some of the labor victories that had happened over the course of a few decades before. What also is central to neoliberalism is that competition is a value. And so it made way for this belief that poverty is a result of laziness rather than design. So for people who got rich, for people who became wealthy, the idea was that they worked harder, and people who were poor because they don't work hard and they're lazy. So rather than understanding the market as favoring those who own the means of production and those who are already wealthy, there was this idea that poverty is a result of the person's inherent lack of will. The other thing that happened that had the biggest impact on the fashion industry was that outsourcing and imposing neoliberal policies and trade treaties was happening. So this resulted in factories moving overseas and corporations pressuring non-Western nations to get rid of social, labor, and environmental protections in order to decrease prices when these factories and corporations moved overseas. So just for some context about how this played out, essentially, Nixon said that capitalism works better than it sounds and socialism sounds better than it works, but actually capitalism only works for corporation executives and business people invested in fossil fuel extraction. And of course, Thatcher and Reagan laughing at all the livelihoods and workers' rights that were eviscerated in a matter of decades by these neoliberal policies that they were pushing. So US and Western European corporations and fashion companies started using post-colonial countries, primarily in Southeast Asia and China, to produce raw materials for fibers and textiles, as well as produce clothing. Even cotton fiber grown in the US is sent to be processed and turned into garments in places thousands of miles away where labor laws and environmental laws were less strict. So over this process of abolishing slavery, emancipation, Jim Crow, the US was still one of the main producers of cotton. In fact, behind India, it was still producing the most cotton, but what was happening was all this cotton was being sent thousands of miles away to be processed and made into clothing because it was now less expensive than having it processed in the US because of these neoliberal policies. So in 1994, about 1,400,000 people worked in the apparel manufacturing industry in the US. By 2010, that was down to less than 400,000. So trade liberalization, which increased in the 1990s, including NAFTA, which is a trade agreement, wiped out most import restrictions and duties on foreign-made clothing. So what that meant is after a couple of decades of neoliberal policies, continued trade liberalizations meant that there was no longer any expenses or barriers to importing clothes from foreign places. So that meant it was a free-for-all. All clothes could be imported from foreign places. The United States lost 900,000 jobs during the 10-year time span following 1994. So after these neoliberal policies became the norm, trade liberalization meant that another nearly 1 million jobs are lost in the apparel manufacturing industry due to continued neoliberal policies that were happening. So less than 3% of clothing in stores is made in the US. About 90%, 98% of clothing production is outsourced. In 1960, about 95% of Americans' clothing was manufactured in the US. Today, 2% of clothing in stores is made in the US. So over several decades, there was a mass decrease in domestic production of clothing due to neoliberal policies that made it possible for it to be less expensive to process clothing thousands of miles away and send it back to us. So not only does this mean that labor and environmental policies are being degraded in countries that we call third world, this also means that pollution from transportation, from transporting clothes thousands of miles across the world is also increasing. So cotton is being sent from the US to Vietnam to be processed, turned into clothes, and sent back. That trip, those thousands of miles, is still less expensive than cultivating the cotton right here in the US. And that is due to neoliberal policies and foreign trade treaties that make it much more expensive to domestically produce clothing. So over these decades, we're seeing the way that the fashion industry is able to cut costs at the cost of our environment and of people in other countries. So the mainstream fashion industry, the focus is to produce the most fiber and textiles for as cheaply as possible, which means not using practices that are good for the environment and not having safe, dignified labor practices. People in non-Western countries are forced to participate in a violent, dangerous system that pollutes the environment to be able to make a living because companies threaten to go elsewhere. So this top photo is about the collapse of a factory, Rana Plaza in India. About 1,300 people were killed because the building manufacturers kept cutting costs because they needed to make a certain amount of clothing for the Western companies that were asking them to make all this clothing quickly, cheaply. And so as a result, 1,300 people lost their lives. And the bottom photo is a photo of all the pollution, the environmental pollution that comes from the textile industries, the washed up clothes, the washed up garments, the chemicals used for dyeing that are put into the waterways. And so the mainstream fashion industry has sort of created a system in which people's lives are not dignified and the environment is not dignified in order to increase profit. This sort of global capitalist imperative, rather than imperative about making environmentally safe, quality pieces. So I want to just give a few more examples of the global impacts of mainstream fashion. So Vietnam is the second biggest clothing manufacturer in the world. Most of our clothing in the US comes from the Vietnam. Primarily, young women work for as little as $40 a month and have to use chemicals that are bad for the atmosphere and bad for their health. There's issues with inhaling these chemicals. There's issues with sexual assault. There's issues with excessive overtime needed just to meet your monthly bills, and even still you don't meet your monthly bills. And what Oxfam found was that only 23% of informal Vietnamese factory workers have health insurance. So not only are they ingesting chemicals that are bad for their health, working for hours on ends, but they can't even afford to go to get themselves taken care of in the healthcare system. So not only is this sort of factory clothing system harming people, it's harming mostly women and people who would be considered women of color in the US. So in places like Vietnam and places like India. I also want to talk about cashmere production. So I'm sure many of us love cashmere, especially in the winter. It's cozy, it's warm. So China and Mongolia produce 90% of the world's cashmere. And it takes about 4 goats to produce enough hair to make one sweater. And so what has started to happen as cashmere production needed to increase, because there was a demand for cashmere, people wanted more cashmere and they wanted more cashmere for less money. Underpaid goat farmers are having to deal with the changing climate conditions and managing bigger herds. So because the price of cashmere has been brought down, they need to herd more goats to make as much fiber as they did before. And because climate change has been affecting Mongolia in particular, if the winter is longer than they expect, they have to shear the goats sooner, which means there's less hair, which means, again, they need more goats to produce less fiber. And they're not making any more money for this extra work and for the extra conditions that are being put on them as a result of the Western world's demand for fiber. So the demand for cashmere increases the amount of goats needed, which results in overgrazing and loss of habitat for endangered wildlife. So as there's more cashmere goats needing to be herded, then they're being grazing all over the environment, which is losing habitat for some of the other wildlife that exists in this region. And so now this region is primarily focused on herding goats for cashmere production, and that limits the biodiversity of this environment. It also limits the natural processes that sequester carbon and that stabilize our climate. So in addition to climate changing as a result of human intervention, there's also processes that are now not allowing people to work in climate beneficial ways because of demand and because of wanting our clothing to be as cheap as possible. And I want to give one more example of rubber production in Liberia. So most of the rubber that's produced in the world, natural rubber, goes to tires, about 60%, but about 40% of rubber that's produced, natural rubber, goes to shoes, protective clothing, exercise clothing. So some of the more outdoors and also active wear that we use has some rubber in it. And according to a 2016 US State Department report, forced labor and child labor specifically is employed in rubber plantations in Burma, Cote d'Ivoire, and Liberia. And so I want to talk about Liberia because it has one of the biggest rubber plantations on the planet. So in the early 20th century, Liberia gave Firestone the right to lease up to 1 million acres, roughly 10% of the country's arable land, for 6 cents per acre for a 99-year lease. It is the biggest rubber plantation on the planet. This is a huge plantation. And so in order for Firestone to create this plantation, again, deforestation was required. There was destruction of wildlife habitats and air and water pollution. So they needed to cut down whole forests and plant rubber trees, which destroyed habitats for other species living in these Liberian forests. And as a result of the process of making rubber, which done in the way that it is today requires chemicals, there's pollution from the chemicals in the air and in the water. A lot of the waste from the facilities was contaminating rivers, creeks, wells, and killing fish. So for the fishing communities in Liberia, the natural rubber production not only affects their health, but also their livelihoods, because they're not able to fish, which is the way that they make money and subsist. Additionally, similarly to slavery in the Americas, there are daily production quotas for rubber tappers, and many people are forced to work on rubber plantations involuntarily. So because natural rubber production is such a huge part of Liberia's economy, many people from surrounding villages are forced to work on these plantations. And there's these terrible quotas for how much rubber they have to tap and carry back to the factory to be processed on these huge, expansive acres. So they're tapping these trees, carrying back the liquid that comes from the rubber trees that's then processed in the facilities, which then the wastewater from is put into the very same creeks and rivers and wells that they need to live. And so this is another example of the ways in which the materials that make up the goods that we buy in the mainstream fashion industry are completely violent to people and the environment and affect all aspects of life. So 80% of garment workers worldwide are women. Textile mills generate 1/5 of the world's industrial water pollution and use 20,000 toxic chemicals. Most of these mills are in poor, non-Western nations full of people of color. The workers who are paid unlivable wages in the fashion industry are on the first two levels of production: raw material cultivation and making raw materials into clothing. So I want to talk about some of the things that we've learned over this course and what can be done to change it. So we know that the impact of fashion is a gender issue. Most garment workers are women. We know it's a labor issue. The labor conditions in which these people are working are horrendous. They're violent. We know it's an environmental issue. There's mass pollution. There's toxic chemicals. There's deforestation. There's soil erosion. We also know it's a post-colonial imperialist issue because the countries who are working in these conditions are mostly former colonies of Europe, or have imperial relationships with the US through trade agreements, world trade agreements, foreign treaties, etc. We also know it's a neoliberal capitalism issue because neoliberal policies and global capitalism has allowed for this devaluation of labor and this devaluation of land to increase profit on the second two levels of the fashion industry. So in the consumer side and on the advertising and promotion side. So this is what we know about the fashion industry. What can we do to change it? My personal feeling is a revolution. Not everyone is willing or ready to participate in revolution, but I want to give some other examples of things that can be done that are subsets, maybe not as intense as revolution, but hopefully will lead to one eventually. So support locally sourced, sustainably made, decentralized, worker-owned clothing. That's a mouthful. So things that are grown domestically in a sustainable way using regenerative agriculture that are decentralized, meaning there's not two countries controlling most of the supply chain, and that are owned by the workers. So not only they're getting paid fair wages, but they have a stake in all of the garments that they're producing. Limit your participation in the fast fashion industry by consuming less, thrifting, making your own clothes, buying from sustainable brands. Now, I know most sustainable brands are more expensive because of neoliberal policies. They can't compete with the fast fashion that's much less expensive. But if you are able to buy less clothing and instead invest in more sustainable, quality made brands and pieces, then that would be a lot better for the environment and would allow you to participate less in this fashion industry. Encourage large brands and fashion houses that you love to be transparent about their supply chains and map out the supply chains of things you own. So try to figure out how your clothing is made, how your footwear is made. Most of these companies keep their supply chains invisible because they are practicing exploitative labor practices, causing environmental pollution. So we have to encourage large brands to be transparent with their supply chains so we could force them to make their supply chains more sustainable, with more dignified labor, with more regenerative practices. Reject and resist foreign policy and global institutions such as the World Trade Organization, IMF, that require countries to devalue their currency, get rid of labor and environmental laws, and give corporations tax breaks. So a lot of the treaties, the deals, the regulations that come from the World Trade Organization, IMF, things like NAFTA requires that these countries that we call third world make their currency more devalued so that labor can be cheaper. And in addition, get rid of any labor laws they have, get rid of environmental regulation, and get rid of taxing corporations so that corporations and factories can move in, not have to pay taxes, not have to worry about environmental degradation, and not have to worry about dignified labor. So by rejecting and resisting these sort of foreign policies and global trade things that our country tries to push on us, we can also help the fashion industry become more sustainable. And of course, overthrow patriarchy, capitalism, and neocolonialism through increasing your awareness and education and participating in the alternatives, learning about alternatives, and understanding the things that are already happening that are sustainable, that are regenerative, that are based in dignified labor, based in quality garment production. So these are just some ideas of how we can not only encourage the fashion industry to be more sustainable and to not participate in these violent practices, but also how we can use alternatives to the fashion industry to still enjoy our clothing and our style, but in a way that's not bad for the earth and not bad for people. So it's some time for some questions. Here's my contact information. And I would love to just try to answer as many questions as possible in the next few minutes. One that I'm seeing is, what do you think led the Liberian government to lease this land to Firestone? Well, one of the issues with colonialism is that it requires you to participate in trade agreements with European and American powers. And often the only way you can participate in the global trade market is by agreeing to things that are not good for your government or your people, but that make certain people a lot of money. And so in the time of Liberia participating in this agreement with Firestone, there was a lot of destabilization. There was a lot of issues with how the country was going to function. Liberia has a very specific history. It was one of the places where Black people who were enslaved in the US were sent back to. So during abolition, there was some movement to send Black people back to Africa. And so the US decided to send a group of formerly enslaved Black people back to Liberia. And what happened is this formerly enslaved group of Black people became a sort of ruling class in Liberia and were in relationship with the American government, which allowed them to have sort of deals with companies like Firestone that were not necessarily good for all Liberians, but were good for a select few of the wealthy Liberians, as well as the executives at Firestone. For only 2% of American clothing is produced in the US, the other 90% is produced overseas. Does this mean produced overseas in third world countries? Does this also include production in European Western countries? So this means produced overseas in primarily third world countries, but this also means produced in Eastern European countries, which are countries like Romania, for example, which have smaller and less lucrative economies than Western European countries. So H&M has factories in Vietnam and India, but also in Romania, for example. So it means primarily in what we call third world countries or what we call the global South, but mostly it just means produced in poor countries with poorer economies. So that can include, in some cases, Eastern European countries, but is primarily countries in Southeast Asia and increasingly in Central and Western Africa. How important do you see freedom of association and the right to unionize in the fight for workers' rights? I think the right to unionize is a hugely important issue. I think workers being able to unionize, although it doesn't solve all the problems, it allows them to at least argue for better wages and argue for better labor conditions. There's an organization in LA called Garment Workers' Rights Center, I believe, and they are focused on unionizing and lobbying and advocating for garment workers' rights in Los Angeles, workers who are exploited in Los Angeles factories, and more broadly in the world. So I think unionizing and building the power of workers is really important to help transition and force the fashion industry to treat workers better. Absolutely. Why was cotton chosen as the best cultivation crop? You mentioned hemp was grown too. Just curious. That's a good question. I don't know if I have a full answer, but hemp actually, while the US was a British colony, hemp was by law required to be grown in the US. So hemp was also seen as a very important fiber. And so it wasn't until the early 20th century that hemp was made illegal, and that was mainly because there were politicians who were invested in the cotton industry who didn't want competition. I don't know if that's the full story, but that's one interpretation, that they wanted to create a market that you can monopolize. Cotton was chosen because of its history of being mass cultivated, and so hemp was made illegal, hemp cultivation, and there was a lot of political processes done to devalue hemp and make it seem like a bad fiber as opposed to cotton. Other questions. Do you know what the reason was for going to Southeast Asia in the 90s, produced mass market for clothing and not Africa? It partially has to do with infrastructure. There was more infrastructure in Southeast Asia for the type of processing that was necessary, but parts of Africa now are being implicated in this fashion industry because they're starting to have the infrastructure necessary for processing fiber and turning it into clothing, but also because there was a huge amount of workers who needed work in Southeast Asia, and there was already relationships with European countries and the US that allowed for treaties to be made to create this home market in Southeast Asia very cheaply. I don't know the other reasons, but those are some of the reasons. How can we fight back to some fashion brands greenwashing their collections? Well, luckily for whoever asked that question, there is a Slow Factory course on greenwashing. So in that course, you could learn a little bit more about how fashion brands are greenwashing their collections and what are things to do to fight back. I think in general, calling out fashion brands on these greenwashing practices, as well as encouraging them, forcing them to make transparent their supply chain so it can be shown how non-sustainable it is a good way to fight back. Is there a resource that assesses the validity, honesty of orgs that rate labor conditions? In this era of greenwashing, how do we know those certifications are trustworthy? That's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head any resources that assess the validity of labor conditions or greenwashing. Again, in the greenwashing course, hopefully they'll talk about that and they can give some resources. I currently don't have any. Can you give or make a brief relationship between slavery and capitalism and how it created a class society based on race, and how the only way to get rid of systemic racism is by abolishing capitalism? Well, I agree with you. I don't know if I can talk about that in brief, but essentially because the United States was built on the degradation of the environment and the degradation of Black people, which was based on this racial ideology of white superiority, which allowed them to justify enslaving Africans, which was really about creating as much profit as possible. The foundation of the US was sort of creating an impetus for profit over people, profit over the environment. And that is sort of the basis of modern day capitalism, is that the imperative is to make as much profit as possible at the expense of people and the environment. And this capitalistic system is based on this racial hierarchy where somebody has to be lower class, somebody has to be poor. And if we could justify Black people being poor because they're inferior, then we could justify having a lot of wealth concentrated in the hands of a few white people. And we can make white people who are poor think that they're poor not because of other white people, but because of Black people. And so the racial ideology present in capitalism is also especially created so that people who are in the same condition, white poor people and Black poor people, don't get together and overthrow wealthy white people or wealthy people in general who are capitalists. And so by creating a racial ideology where you divide people by race, they're not going to come together to overthrow a system that's actually bad for everyone. So essentially, capitalism is about crushing class consciousness so that they can continue to hoard wealth for a few people. But what I hope that is understood through this conversation about cotton in the fashion industry is that the imperative for profit, which is the capitalist imperative, is always going to be about the violence against Black people. It's always going to be about degrading the earth. And it's always going to be about making as much money as possible for a small subset of people. And so in order to change that, we have to change the way society is structured, make it more collectively owned, make it more sustainable, make it more decentralized, make it more locally, regionally based. And the fashion industry and garments and fiber is a way that we can do that, because in the US and in the world, each bioregion has enough natural resources to create fiber and textiles. And there's enough artisans and designers who can make clothing in a sustainable way. So we don't actually have to rely on the mainstream fashion industry, even though they want us to. And we can encourage them and force them to shift their practices by participating in alternatives and forcing them to become transparent with their supply chains, and forcing our country, particularly the US, to not engage in foreign policies that is bad for other countries and other countries' geographies. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining me today for our class on the impact of fashion on the environment and labor throughout different periods of history until now. As with all of these courses, when the semester ends, they will be available and free online for you to watch. And they will be more classes that are happening over the next couple of weeks. So tune into Slow Factory to see about other classes if you're not already signed up. Thank you for joining us.